Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. Politics moves so quickly. There's so much complexity, but there's some stories that are conversations that are really worth taking the time to unpack. Now, we've talked about the problem that Alberta has with orphan wells for quite some time, and there's a lot of different solutions that have been proposed. Some of them are a little bit more, let's go with problematic, than others. And to help us make sense of one of the ones that, in a fascinating twist, the new Premier of Alberta is apparently advocating for, we're joined by Mark Dorin and Regan Boychuk. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.
Mark, if it's okay with you, before we get into sort of the minutia of what are orphan wells, why are they bad, and why is this R-Star program so very bad, who are you? Who do you work with? What's your stake in this?
Well, I'm a 45-year oil and gas guy. In the last 10 or 15 years, I've switched more to representing landowners. So I do represent landowners in front of administrative tribunals like the Land and Property Rights Tribunal, and on regulatory matters, safety, etc., in front of the Alberta Energy Regulator. And we've recently, about 2 years ago, formed a federation called the Polluter Pay Federation. So most of our laws to use land and to produce minerals, or to even do power line activities, etc., or pipeline activities in Alberta, are based on the polluter pay principle. So we're a group that represents real property owners, minerals and surface, that advocate for the rights of those parties. And our mandate is to educate the public, to try to generate some capital, which you haven't really done yet, to push back a counter lobby to industry's powerful lobby that results in things like R-Star that we're going to talk about. And the third one, to try to generate some capital where we can litigate key issues in the courts. So that's really my background. And the thing we're doing right now is Polluter Pay Federation.
Okay. Regan, what's your story?
I'm the researcher. I'm a political scientist who grew up in northern Alberta. My dad was a heavy mechanic in the oil patch in the 80s. And after I finished grad school, I started studying the oil and gas industry. Back in the early 2000s, I was involved with the 2007 royalty review with the Parkland Institute. Later worked there doing some peer-reviewed work on profits and royalties in oil and gas, and have continued to have an interest and to study critically the oil and gas industry, simply because it's so important here in my home province. And over the last 7 years, that focus has shifted towards cleanup and the huge problem that is accumulated under our nose. And then I came to appreciate how that's closely connected with royalties and the profitability. I've been trying to raise alarm about that there's no profits left out there. And I've come to appreciate that's why we can't hold these folks accountable for cleanup either. And so all that work has brought me into contact with lots of regular Albertans like Mark, who suffer the business end of these issues. We have a lot of trouble raising them in the media and raising awareness, but we know there's a lot of support for it. The law is on our side, and we're struggling to try to pursue those solutions because both the regulator and politicians aren't standing up to make the polluter pay. And so Mark and I are doing what we can and using our expertise to try to help Albertans establish the rule of law, protect themselves, and get a just return for our resources.
So just to get the inevitable comments section dealt with, from what you gentlemen have both described, neither of you are against oil and gas.
Definitely not. Personally, I'm only against illegal and unsafe oil and gas. I've been in the oil and gas industry all my life, and I'm certainly not against oil and gas. It's provided me with a pretty good living and provided Alberta with a lot of prosperity. But I do think that we've improperly managed our resources. We could have been a world leader. We could have shown the world how to do it right. We have the laws that allow us to do that better than anybody else's laws, but we've blown it. We've got unsafe activities, and we've got messes that we haven't cleaned up all over this province. It's really a bad state.
Okay. And Regan, I assume that you're not saying that we should shut down oil and gas across the province entirely?
No, not at all. My concern is allowing unprofitable oil and gas development to continue. It's a fool's game that fills crooked pockets and leaves us with an ever larger bill that there's no one to save for.
Okay. So to start with, because there is a little bit to unpack in this this issue, would one of you gentlemen be so kind as to explain what are, because the crux of this whole thing seems to be the things called orphan wells or well site remediation. What are we talking about when we're talking about orphan wells and well site remediation?
I'll take that one, Nate. So the concept of an orphan in Alberta is very different and quite a bit broader than elsewhere, particularly in North America. And this is because of our unique statutory scheme in Alberta. We've done things our own way, and we have our own unique way where land rights and mineral rights are titled. So in particular, we have in Alberta a provision at law for establishing a fund. And this fund is paid for by remaining industry or companies that have not yet filed for bankruptcy. So this orphan fund is the ultimate safety net or catch-all, I like to call it, protecting Alberta citizens from the cost of safely retiring these wells at the end of their economic life and cleaning up the land as required by the comprehensive environmental protection laws that we have that also protect surface landowner rights. So put another way, if our so-called liability management system, that's what you'll hear a lot of, doesn't work or is gutted, it was largely recently gutted, in our opinion, the orphan fund protects the bank accounts and the wallets, if you will, of Albertans. So prior to explaining a little bit more about this all-important orphan fund, I'll deal with what an orphan actually is. And the law has no definition. And then I'll touch on the subject of liability management really briefly. So I'll add that both Regan and I participated in 6 days of government liability management sessions in 2017. So we participated with industry people, government, stakeholder, municipality, etc. for 6 days. What do we do? How do we manage these things? So in that, and those sessions a few years back, the government defined an orphan this way, and I'll read it exactly from that definition. So it's a well, a facility, or a pipeline where the licensee is unable or unwilling to pay for closure. Now, closure is defined separately as abandonment, which means sealing or plugging of a well or decommissioning of a facility, land remediation if it's contaminated, and reclamation means restoring it back to its original condition. And these sites become the responsibility of what's called the Orphan Well Association. So I'm going to give a little bit broader definition of that, which is based on the law. So in Alberta, there's really 4 things that make an orphan. So an orphan is a well or a facility. It cannot be a pipeline, contrary to popular belief. That is, number 1, or A, licensed or otherwise permitted at law under the provisions of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act, or this is the law that establishes the orphan fund itself. So B, that this well or facility has no responsible company holding the license, and there's no other company with a working interest in the minerals that are related to this well. C, it's designated or named as an orphan by the regulator. In this case, it's the Alberta Energy Regulator, also referred to as the AR. And D, this well or facility is to be retired or closed, okay? Which means plugged or sealed as to a well with related land cleanup performed by the Orphan Well Association. And the cost is covered by this orphan fund, which I've spoken of. So there are some types of wells that are specifically excluded, and this is really important to our discussion today. Okay, so particularly what the actual cost is to remaining industry of the responsibilities that arise from these laws currently on the book. So first, wells that aren't included as orphans are those wells that should be designated as orphans. So there's the companies are insolvent, but they haven't gone into bankruptcy. They're just sitting there. A lot of these companies, there's 200 or some of these companies right now And these wells, these companies might not even have an office. The wells are out there, but they haven't gone into insolvency proceedings. And the latest figures of the AR indicate there's maybe about 8,000 wells like this right now. And then the second category of excluded wells that aren't orphans are what we call legacy wells. These are wells that were abandoned or plugged long ago in the past, and land cleanup occurred and a reclamation certificate was issued, but there is still no responsible well licensee to intervene or cover the cost. For example, if the well should leak, which has happened, and particularly in urban areas, or if there's some problem that arises with land remediation or reclamation, etc. So I'm almost done. So just turning quickly now back to the Orphan Fund. It's a fund maintained by a levy that's periodically imposed on industry. And it's established by the provisions of Section 11 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. So the Orphan Fund's sole purpose is to fund retirement of orphan wells and facilities, or to pay for the end of life expenses or closure of these wells and facilities where there's no responsible well or facility licensee or working interest participant in those minerals. So the most important things to understand about this Orphan Fund are the following. First of all, there's really three things. The entire Orphan Fund is a slight twist on the polluter pay principle. So it is the polluting industry, in this case, under the Orphan Fund, that's ultimately responsible at law when the actual polluter, or the well licensee or the facility licensee, cannot be held responsible, can't be found, or is insolvent and hasn't emerged from bankruptcy. So industry, the second point is industry agreed to this, which is what Premier Smith is overlooking, in our view, as a lobbyist in her previous life as a lobbyist. So in return for not having to put up bonds or surety or deposits to cover end-of-life costs, and in return for being able to transfer these poor assets, or what we call liability dumping, in return for being able to do this with no oversight by the regulator, industry agreed years ago to establish this Orphan Fund. So it's not something mean or new to be imposed. It's what's been under the understanding of industry for a very long time. And the third point is it's the statutory task, or the job at law of the regulator, to periodically set this levy. How much does each company have to pay into the Orphan Fund to cover the expense of expediently retiring orphans as they are named orphans? And so this is not happening. We don't have enough money in there. We know from Freedom of Information requests that industry associations are asked how much money they should put up, for example, this year. And there's some pretty arbitrary figures. For example, 70 million was the last levy for the last year. And we know that this amount would be much greater if wells were properly designated as orphans. So people can look to Section 73, subsection 2 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act for that requirement to set the levy. And so to wrap up, there are some industry and business lobbyists that advocated for changes to this liability management system in parallel with advocating for R-Star. And formerly, there were some circumstances set out in a previous directive of the AR called Directive 006. And this set out when companies, as they approached insolvency, when they had to put up securities. And the purpose of this was to protect the Orphan Fund and to protect citizens. So what happened is that in December 2021, just about a year ago, not quite a year ago, this Directive 6 was changed. And so these lobbyists have been partially successful. There's no longer any criteria where you have to put up security that we can identify. And therefore, the importance of the Orphan Fund is now greater. This safety net that we have, the importance of understanding, and it's the last thing that stands between these operators and the taxpayer, it's become of even greater importance. So that's what an orphan is, and more importantly, that's what the Orphan Fund is and how it's supposed to be managed.
Okay, I'm just gonna throw some stuff back at you to make sure that I understand this properly, because I'm I'm really not that bright. So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is back when oil companies started to oil company, they negotiated a deal with the provincial government where they said, you know what, we don't want to pay up front. We don't want to have to cover the costs up front for dealing with the I'm going to use the word damage that exists from and potential damage that exists from drilling oil and gas wells. So here's what we'll do. We'll have this fund on the side and we'll all contribute a little bit to this fund. And then that's how we'll take care of it. Am I getting that right so far?
That's more or less right, but Reagan calls this the no look back deal, and I'm going to let him address it a little bit too, because that's the important part of it. But in essence, that's right. So the producers of the past have said things like, hey, if we have to put up security, we won't have as much capital available to drill wells and this sort of thing. So they convinced presumably the regulators and definitely the politicians of the day, but more the regulators, because the way we do things in Alberta is that legislation grants the powers to regulators to do certain things, and they're deemed to be experts. So our MLAs of the past who created great laws said, these regulators have more experience in these matters than we do. So let's let them make some of the sub rules, if you will. So I'll let Regan comment on this as well, but you essentially have it right. But there's a long history here. So if we go starting to change it now, we've more or less been, we're changing the rules of the game that everyone's been playing by for 75 years or more in Alberta. Go ahead, Regan.
Yeah, the best lesson Albertans can remember is our previous attempts to make the polluter pay and to have industry, oil and gas, be responsible, because these aren't new issues. And this isn't the first time we've tried this. In 1990, the Getty cabinet and the ERCB, the regulator at the time, and the accounting industry, and even the Canadian bankers all tried to make the polluter pay. It was a very concerted effort. And instead of enforcing polluter pay explicitly, they made a deal saying, okay, we won't look backwards. We'll let you guys give your wells to whoever you want, and we'll never look backwards for cleanup costs. But in exchange for that deal, you guys promise to fully fund all resulting orphans. Those are the explicit words of the head regulator describing the bargain he made in 1991. They made that deal, and that deal, that was a secret deal, and hardly anyone knows about it. But it is reflected in legislation. By 1999, the Orphan Well Association, as we know it now, had been created by legislation. It was funded by a levy by remaining companies, and it was expanded to include remediation and reclamation. Everyone agreed to it at the time, and that was the fulfillment of the agreement. We let you guys do whatever you want, and you will fund the orphans. We upheld our end of the bargain. The regulator has let them run wild for 30 years. They've never stopped a license transfer. They've never looked backwards to a previous producer when it's time to clean up. They've upheld their side of the deal. Now the orphans have piled up. They've started to become a problem, and it's time for industry to start funding them. But it's naturally cheaper to fund lobbyists to try to get out of it, to try to get around the existing law. And that's where we are today. We have very good law. All we need is to follow it. But strangely, that's the challenge in Alberta, is having a public body follow existing law is an incredible challenge, but it is the solution to this issue.
Let's talk about the scope of this thing, because it sounds like what we've been doing as a province, as well as some of the oil, because I think probably not all oil companies are dicks about this kind of thing. There's probably some ones that do the cleanup, but very clearly there is there's been tons of media coverage about how big the problem is. So we're not just talking about like, there's this well out by Three Hills and nobody's paying attention to it. The federal government transferred in upwards of $1 billion, and most of what I read at the time was, well, that might make a dent, but it's not going to address the size of the problem. So can you speak to like how big of a problem is? Because one of the things I think that Albertans struggle with is, we can talk about orphan wells are bad, but when you say Alberta has this much of a deficit, people go, ugh. So how much of if we were to call the orphan well cost, the amount to fix the orphan well cost, if we were to call that a deficit for fun, How much are we talking about?
Well, not according to me, but according to the head bureaucrat, the chief official in Alberta, the vice president of closure and liability at the Alberta Energy Regulator, Robert Wadsworth. He did an internal study with his subject matter experts, and his back of the napkin estimate for how much it'll cost to clean up Alberta's wells and pipelines and the oil sands was at least, he knew that was an underestimate and would be much bigger, but he said $260 billion, a quarter trillion.
260 billion. That's with a B.
Yes. Quarter trillion with a T.
That's not a small number.
No.
So obviously, when we're talking about a quarter trillion dollars to deal with the sort of the I'm going to call it an overdraft that we have allowed oil companies to create, that in theory, like here's my next question I'm going to just go to. How much money does the Orphan Well Fund have, and how far away is it from a quarter trillion dollars?
Well, Mark already told you it has $70 million. That's it. It operates on a 1-year basis. Its budget is set once a year. It collects money once a year. It plans 1 year at a time. It has $70 million in it.
That's
and
a
let's be
lot.
clear, that's just for orphans. And what the number Regan is quoting, that's to clean up everything that's beyond orphans. That's all wells and all oil sands, etc. But we also we belong to a group called Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project, and Regan headed up research, and we had press conferences at the start of the last election about, and we estimated just what it would cost to clean up just conventional oil wells in this province. And that's what really our star is more about than oil sands. And I'll let Regan speak to that number and how he came up with it. But we had a workshop in Didsbury, Alberta, not long after that. And we went through these are just closure costs we're talking about. There's all manner of other liabilities like potential groundwater contamination, landowner payments, on and on and on. That's not even included in the quarter trillion. It could be $1 trillion easily. We just don't know, and there's really no way to accurately estimate these. But Reagan did. I'll let him talk about how he estimated the cost of just conventional well cleanup.
Okay, Regan, I have a feeling this isn't going to be good news, but what you got over there, man?
Well, the good news is how authoritative the bad news is. The source of my bad news is the Alberta Energy Regulator. It's Robert Wadsworth, that internal study he did in 2018. Very serious. They spent a lot of money. They brought in 4 private sector service companies that had decades of experience each, and they developed hundreds of different scenarios for all the different sorts of wells there are, the different areas of the province, cost, incredibly detailed stuff. And I got it through a Freedom of Information request. And all the ALDP did was take that information that scared them. They stopped the project as we finished their job, as they came up with 368 different scenarios with lobbyists about all the different types of wells. And so what the ALDP did was take the 300,000 wells in Alberta that still need to be cleaned up, and we sorted them into those 368 different cleanup scenarios that the regulator and industry had developed, and used their own private sector estimates that they had commissioned to estimate what's the real cost. What does the regulator really think it's going to cost to clean up just the 300,000 oil and gas wells, not the pipelines or the oil sands? And ALDP's numbers were between $40 and $70 billion, between 2 and 3.5 times what the regulator was saying publicly. And that's not me. That's not ALDP. That's the regulator's own data. We got hundreds of thousands of lines of spreadsheets of their analysis through Freedom of Information. It's all been transparent and available, but we haven't been able to give it away. Nobody wants to know. These are the gold standard of estimates ever. No regulator anywhere has ever done anything since. But it gives a glimpse of how big the problem is. We have a very good understanding of it. That's not what's holding us back here. It's the lack of political will to force someone to spend money cleaning something up, and that's what's missing here in Alberta.
And apparently, at least three zeros because 70 million is somewhat shy of 70 billion. And again, as you pointed out, that's only the orphan wells. So, I mean, that's a big problem. There's probably going to require a myriad of solutions, but let's get to what we're here to talk about today, which is the R-Star program. Now, we talked about it a bit on our episode on the 23rd, and we had a bunch of people say, wait, what? So can one of you gentlemen explain what is R-Star? What is the idea behind it?
Well, I just want to start out and say we're not advocates for R-Star, so we can only tell as much about R-Star that's been put out in the public domain. So um, it is promoted to be a job creation project. It's said to be the brainchild of something called Sustaining Alberta's Energy Network, or SANE, which is an industry group. But we also have information, pretty reliable information, that there was a previous program that had a different name before. So whether it's actually a brainchild of SANE or not, we really don't know. But there's lots of evidence to indicate it's not. We know definitely that it was previously rejected by the government of Alberta when it was proposed to them, particularly through the former energy minister, Sonia Savage, who condemned it in no uncertain terms. It's contrary to the polluter pay principle. And we know that Pete Guthrie, the newly appointed energy minister, advocated for it, including in the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. And this was confirmed more or less by the new premier in an interview in the Western Standard just a few days ago. And she said that Pete Guthrie, the new energy minister, and Sonia Savage, which has been transferred over to environment and protected places, she said they'll get it done. And we know that big oil, really not juniors, will be the big benefactors because they're the ones paying for the orphan fund levy. And that's 70 million per year, Nate, and it's inadequate. That's per year right now they're paying for orphan fund levy. So this is very expensive for remaining industry, and remaining industry is, largely based on how many well licenses you have. So the big guys are paying for the orphans more than the smaller guys. So, and we know that it's a rip in the safety net. It's a big, huge tear in the safety net that I described before. That's the orphan fund. So I'll let Regan perhaps carry on from here, but that's what we know about R-Star.
Okay. Before we get to Regan, I just want to highlight something that I think is important. One of the things that Mr. Kenney lauded about the previous energy minister, Sonia Savage, was her extensive experience in oil and gas, particularly oil and gas law. And as you were chatting there, I just looked up Mr. Guthrie's experience prior to it doesn't look comparative, is what I would say.
Yeah, well, we do know that he was ahead of some sort of a energy, 14 or 15 MLAs made some sort of an energy caucus, and he headed that up. That's the information that's out there. But no, he's a private businessman. He's an engineer, but not in the oil patch. And I think Ms. Savage she was a pipeline lobbyist in her past life, but she does have a master's degree in law, and particularly I think in environmental law. So she has definitely some qualifications. But I'll let Regan address what the rest of what R-Star is really about, which is it's definitely tied to royalties. And Regan knows as much or more about the history of royalties in this province because he's researched this matter and been involved in those activities in the past where I haven't. So I'll let him address how it's tied to royalties.
Okay. I just want to take a quick sec to highlight again what we just kind of boiled down a little bit there. Sonia Savage, who was the energy minister who wore all of the I Love Canadian Oil and Gas, who campaigned with Jason Kenney aggressively on the jobs economy pipelines. Boy, we're going to go with oil and gas. She has years of experience in the industry. She has education and background in the industry, and she rejected the program. So, Regan, go.
Well, our star is certainly a royalty program, and that's the way it should be understood. And Albertans should appreciate they were giving away our oil and gas to mostly foreign producers, where in recent years, for every dollar of oil and gas that we produce, Albertans get about 5 cents. We get about a nickel of every dollar is what the public receives in exchange for our oil and gas. And so we get a very small amount. Under Lougheed, his objective, he wanted to collect 35 cents of every dollar. And during his term in office, we collected exactly 35 cents of every dollar. Not hard to do if you want to. It's eroded since. We're down. It was 3 cents in recent years. With the oil sands bump, it's going to push us up a little. But in recent years, we've been collecting a nickel of every dollar. And that's why we're broke. That's why we have deficits, is because of the royalty cuts we've endured and only collecting that nickel. Our star is a fancy, complicated, covert program to give that 5 cents back to oil and gas so they can improve their environmental and social governance scores with investors and pay for their cleanup. It's a royalty rebate program to fund cleanup. Instead of making the polluter pay, the public is going to give back the only nickel we do get for our oil and gas, and we're going to give it back to them so they can clean up stuff they've been hiding since the 60s. That is the essence of the program, and that's why it involves the energy minister, not the regulator, because it's a royalty program, not a regulatory issue. And because it's tied to money, and because it involves such a big problem, 70 billion, according to the regulator's own internal study just for the wells. That's why this issue has to be an electoral issue. We can't have Miss Smith and whoever her cabinet is or whoever does what make such a big, important, expensive decision without it being an electoral issue.
Okay.
And Nate, if I might, I'm just going to retread where you just were. I will read the rejection of Miss Sonia on behalf of the government of Alberta to you, because it really underlines some of these principles we're talking about. So she wrote the following on June 21st, 2021, just a little over a year ago. The government of Alberta has decided not to accept the R-Star proposal. After close consideration, we determined the proposal does not align with the province's royalty regime or our approach to liability management and upholding the polluter pays principle. The polluter pays principle is a guiding philosophy for liability management in Alberta and is supported by landowners, municipalities, industry associations, investors, environmental groups, and Indigenous communities. So that's a pretty strong rejection. The question, just to follow up on Regan, just said about why we need to have this, in my view, a by-election issue in Medicine Hat Brooks now, and election issue in May, I humbly submit, is that that's a really strong rejection. Why? If we're going to actually adopt R-Star or parts of it, which would appear to be the case based on the Premier herself keeps bringing it up there's no journalist asking questions about R-Star yet. So congratulations for the first discussion of it.
And we're not journalists.
And we're not journalists. There you go. Exactly. And you know what? That's probably why this is going to be one of the best ways to discuss these, super important issues to all Albertans and real pragmatic solutions, not bailouts for broke industry that big business would really benefit from. So we say that's an election issue because why, if they adopt part of R-Star, why such a massive 180-degree reversal in policy? That's pretty obvious.
Well, there's probably an argument to be made that it's profoundly on brand, given how many UCP MLAs and leadership candidates said, oh my God, Smith and her policies are catastrophic, and now most of them are in cabinet. So, Regan, If I can ask, one of the ways that Smith has sort of pitched R Star is she's said, well, the way that it would work is if you clean up your well. So if you do the thing that you promised that you do, you'll get a bonus that you can carry on to building more wells. Is that your understanding of things as well, Regan?
Yep. And she's describing a guarantee of fraud. We just described to you the enormous difference between the public estimates of how much these sites are going to cost to clean up and the real experts' internal estimate of how much. But she wants to give taxpayer credits for cleanup to the worst companies that don't even have any production. And she wants an open market for them to trade them with other companies who are drilling, and they'll be able to use the credits to subsidize their drilling. That's how R Star works. And so it's critical that there's an open market for these wildly mispriced credits, that they'll say they're worth so much, maybe they're worth as much, but what they are is a taxpayer guarantee for up to $1 million, according to the letter we've seen from Smith describing the R Star program. So these incredibly valuable credits she wants to give to the worst of worst licensees, and then she wants the regulator to step back and there to be an open market for these hoodlums to trade them with drillers who can cash them in for against their drilling expenses. The way the current royalty regime works, all horizontal fracking costs are reimbursed with free oil and gas. Since 2016, minus that token 5% payment, all drilling and fracking costs are paid with free oil. That's all Smith wants to do, is add the cleanup costs. You get free oil and gas for your cleanup costs, just like you do for your fracking costs now. And so it's guaranteed to make the wrong people rich, the profit from this. And even worse, there's actually in her letter, there's 2 pilot programs. There's 2 R Stars. There's one for the worst of the worst companies, and there's a second one for companies that are still good. And she wants to give them double credits to guarantee them at least 100% profit just for taking our money to clean something up. It's wildly absurd, but it shows who will really benefit from her proposal. She has small companies and folksy guys up front about this, trying to make it as struggling small companies. There are struggling small companies here in Alberta, but they don't have a future producing these stripper wells that are blowing out fumes. Their future is in cleaning up wells. There's full employment in the oil and gas sector cleaning up all this stuff for decades to come, but only if we can make the polluter pay. If we don't, if there's no look backs, if the polluter doesn't have to pay, then our only solution will be trying to find some way to trick taxpayers into throwing some more money into something happening, like the federal government did a couple of years ago, like they're trying to do in Ontario, and like Smith is trying to do here. It's the only hope. If the industry is lawless, if we can't hold them accountable, that is our only option. How to trick taxpayers into footing the bill. And unfortunately, there isn't a political party or other journalists or environmental groups really concerned taking up this issue. Polluter pay, this is what we've been focused on, what we've been staring at, what we've seen coming. We met with Smith and Kinnear about R Star last summer, told them it was a scam. She lied to us about it. We met with her in early July. So after the letter that Mark just read from Savage, where Savage said the government of Alberta rejects it, when I met with Smith, she told me she had the ear of the minister. And after she met with us, and we told both of them it was a scam. And after the meeting, she still offered me a spot in a pilot program. And in her letter that we now have that came at the end of July, she's saying that Savage agreed to a pilot. 1 month after Savage explicitly on behalf of the government rejected R Star, we have a letter from Smith saying that the minister had agreed to a pilot, the same pilot that Smith was offering me a spot in, and a photo op of my grandpa's well that had been highlighted in ALDP's job report. And so it's not clear which side Savage was on, which side Smith was on, what was the real status of R Star under the UCP government. Smith brought it up the morning before she was sworn in. She brought up R Star at her first press conference as the premier. She appointed the only guy who endorsed her, who explicitly endorsed our star. She's screaming that this is a red hot priority, but journalists are still batting 1,000 in yet to ask a question, yet to print a story. It's a major threat to the last nickel we collect. We should be very concerned.
Do you think there's, and I'll throw this to both of you gentlemen, I've read stories on the interwebs that there is some, let's go with inconsistency as to how well wells are remediated. There's no shortage of stories where people have said, yeah, the guy came by, looked at it, and was like, it's all good. There's no explicit requirements for soil testing. There's no explicit requirements for how these things are determined to be remediated. And there have been accusations in some media outlets that it's the remediation game is in and of itself maybe a little bit crooked. Does it make any sense to roll out a program like our star that is predicated on, if you remediate things, then we'll let you have free money, but we're not going to address the piss poor job that has been done with remediation in a lot of cases thus far? Am I completely off base here, or?
Well, you're somewhat off
base.
base, but go ahead, Regan. But yeah, I mean, I just had some recent experience about this that I'll relay. So,
okay,
go ahead, Regan.
You're both on base and off. That
I do that.
Let Mark talk about. Let Mark go first, and then I'll explain both here. We'll let him say something clear before I wishy-wash it.
Okay.
So remediation means the cleanup of land where a substance of concern has been spilled. So it's cleanup of spills, and that has to occur before any what's called a reclamation can occur. And reclamation is really just restoring the land back to its capacity that's near equivalent to what it was before it was taken for the oil and gas activity or any other. So we have lots of activities that require reclamation and remediation. They're listed in a schedule attached to the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act. Section or part 5 of that act deals with remediation, and part 6 deals with reclamation. So we have very specific laws and all kinds of guidelines, soil test guidelines, all manner of requirements that have to be met in terms of remediation and reclamation. Very comprehensive laws. Now this has to be done by a soil scientist or other accredited third-party person who has to sign off on it. And so this is the way the statutory scheme is set up. However, we've had soil scientists signing off on stuff that shouldn't have been signed off with. They are just recently canceled a whole bunch of reclamation certificates for that reason. And I just went through personally on family lands a hearing at the Alberta Energy Regulator into the reclamation of the site on my family lands in an urban location in Alberta. They didn't clean the site up. And so there was numerous problems, one of which was that the inputs to the computer called One Stop at the AR proven in the hearing, anybody can read about it, the three hearing commissioners of the Alberta Energy Regulator found that the computer that issues reclamation certificates, which also issues well licenses, etc., had glitches in it for years and was cranking out incorrect certificates. And I told them about this for 2 or 3 years. And the hearing commissioners chastised the regular decision makers at the Alberta Energy Regulator. Why did Dorin have to go through all this time and expense to get a simple problem solved? And the CEO of the AR just apologized to me in person, Regan, in Drayton Valley only a few weeks ago, because he heard about this. And so it's a mess, and I can assure you that even after, so these decisions are made at the AR arbitrarily and capriciously by regular decision makers without hearings. Hearings of the Alberta Energy Regulator are extremely rare in Alberta. The only one we've had really recently that's comprehensive was for coal mining. So we haven't had an oil and gas hearing issue in Alberta for years. The only one we had recently was my reclamation certificate appeal, and they didn't clean up. They didn't clean up according to these standards, and yet they still issued the reclamation certificate and still confirmed it. So we have great laws, but we're just circumventing them or ignoring them. And industry knows how to do this very, very well. And we really have a problem with administrative decision making in this province, and lack of people that get hurt by these decisions. They have to have $1 million, $2 million to go fight it in the court, and nobody has the money. So this is what happens here, and this is why we started the Polluter Pay Federation. We really need to be able to try to enforce these laws. So it's not a law problem, Nate. Let's be very clear that we have probably the best laws in the world, and this is why our politicians can stand up and say, hey, ethical oil. It's pointing to the laws. It's not pointing to reality on the ground. There's nothing more unethical than venting gas or walking away from your polluted land like these irresponsible operators in Alberta do every day. So we have irresponsible operators and we have not so bad operators. And we've got to weed out the irresponsible ones, because they can take Alberta down. So like I said at the start, we've got the laws to do it right. We could set the world example. We still can. We have an orphan fund that allows us uniquely in Alberta to escape this as citizens and taxpayers. It's not too late. We can still make the polluter pay. There's an incredible profitability from tar stands. We don't have to throw up our hands and pay for it as taxpayers like they're doing right now in America with about 1 million or 2 million orphan wells. It's not too late here. So that's our message as the Polluter Pay Federation. Return to the rule of law and we will solve 99.9% of this. That's our very, very simple message.
Yeah, it seems to me, just based on what you said there, that if you're going to say, hey, we've got this problem with flat tires, there's a lot of flat tires out there, maybe making sure that people aren't just throwing bubble gum on them and being like, I'm done. That would be an important part of the equation before you move on to giving them the money to pay for more bubble gum. But Regan, you were going to do some stuff after that. So what do you got?
Yeah, so you're right. There is a real problem with reclamation standards. We literally do not know how to properly reclaim a site. We just haven't put in the time and effort. We don't maintain the standards, and there's no certified site anywhere in Alberta that would withstand scrutiny. It's a major problem across North America with all regulators. But my quibble was going to be that R-Star has a solution. It isn't that there isn't a solution. The R-Star wants to solve it. Mark's solution, our solution, is the Orphan Well Association and the law. R-Star wants to solve this issue of the low standards and the fraud that's involved, because 2016, it's a regulator computer that automatically gives out a certificate. There's no scrutiny. There's no field audit. Nobody goes, digs, and looks for anything ever. They give out thousands from a computer. And so we know that's a problem. But R-Star is going to solve it by, they want to give everything to the Orphan Well Association to do the cleanup, and they want it to sit there instead of being returned to landowners or being returned to the Crown in its recent state. It's going to be babysat by the OWA, and so that's how they're going to get around that problem, that the standards are low, that people aren't even living up to those standards. R-Star would have it returned to the industry-controlled and woefully underfunded OWA to babysit, instead of being handed back to landowners who would then have legal title and could scrutinize it, or back to the Crown, so we could do something else with it or scrutinize it. But it's very shady. Another very concerning element of R-Star, it would cut out that ultimate return of handing back the land. That was the original agreement. Landowners can't refuse this development, and they're not allowed to profit from it. So in exchange, we have to treat them fairly and put it back the way we found it. If we're not doing that, it was a scam the whole time. And we're running out of time to pay to make that right. Otherwise, farmers are just going to be left to suffer 300,000 holes that aren't going anywhere.
There's another factor. We so-called abandoned wells, which means plugging and sealing in accordance with Alberta Energy Regulator Directive 020. It's a rule that says how you basically plug these well bores and then cut them off below surface. You're driving over them, Nate, you don't know it. They're in your kids' playgrounds, you don't know it. They're in parking lots. They're in almost every farmer's field in Alberta. And many of them are leaking gas. And we know in places like Texas, where they get to be older, I mean, there's geysers spraying up 200 feet in the air for years and nobody's doing anything about them, of salt water. So we rely on steel and oil well cement to seal these wells. It will not seal these wells forever. They will, each and every one of them will leak in the future. This is every 50 years or so, all these hundreds of thousands of wells in Alberta, there's about pushing 600,000 oil and gas and injection wells, will have to be re-entered. This is why these licensees, the license is supposed to track with the company that did the work, that made the profits forever. Not right now, once we issue reclamation certificates, they stopped transferring the licenses to the responsible party. And they just fixed that last December. Prior to that, Directive 6 said, once a reclamation certificate's issued, and that has to do with the land, nothing to do with the wellbore, they're two separate things, then we don't transfer the well licensees. So in Alberta, it's illegal for anyone except the well licensee or a designate of the AR to touch a well or to work on a well or to re-abandon wells. And I've got clients in urban areas that can't develop their land for residential use because there used to be an oil field there. And someone has to go in and relook at that well and make sure it's safe, but it's licensed by an incorrect party. And when we filed to the Alberta Energy Regulator to have this really simple problem solved, they throw our applications in file 13 in the trash. And I'm talking to you from Red Deer, Alberta, Northwest Red Deer. I cannot get to my house without driving over an abandoned well. My neighborhood's full of them. There's only a few towns and cities in Alberta that don't have abandoned wells in them. Only a few, a very small number. It's a huge problem. It's not a rural problem. It's just as much of an urban problem as it is a rural problem. I want to make that point very strongly. And these wells are emitting really dangerous gases that we don't know they're odorless, tasteless, and colorless. We don't know we're breathing them. They're giving us diseases like cancer and like Parkinson's disease in record numbers in Alberta. It's a massive health problem, and we can fix it, but we don't have the political will. So it's time we smartened up in Alberta and started doing things right. We just haven't been. We can lead the world. We can show the world. And in this stage in our human history, I think it's time for somebody to step up, do it right, show the world how to do it, like we brag we're doing, but we're not. We've got to put our money where our mouth is and actually do it.
So I guess here's my big question as we're. I mean, I'm going to ask you guys if there's anything that you want to add in just a minute or two. But here's my big question. In the interest of, I don't know, fairness or something, is there anything, like, we hear people say that Danielle Smith is a very intelligent woman. We hear people say that she went to school in economics. One would think that if it wasn't just a scam to funnel money to shitty oil companies, that there would be things that people could point to and go, but there's this good thing about it, and but there's this good thing about it. Do you see any of those good things?
I guess that's why they needed a completely disgraced politician to bring back from the netherworld to try to run this through the end zone after the buzzer had run out. Could be to have a referendum and check it.
I'm just going to comment. Regan and I discussed this in a bit different way, but before, this morning and before we came on, and I spoke about these legacy wells. There are these wells that have been plugged. They have been issued reclamation certificates in the past, but they didn't transfer the licenses. And so now, if there's a problem, nobody, who's the responsible party that's supposed to do the work and incur the costs? And so if we were to, let me first say that we are advocates for polluter pay, and at no time should any landowner and a citizen have to incur one penny of cost. A big part of polluter pay is landowner compensation, and they force their way onto our lands. We're not making money as landowners. We're supposed to only be able to recover our costs, but we're not recovering our costs, I assure you. So, if there was something where we might want to give a royalty credit, it might be to clean up a few of these really old legacy wells that are real problems, especially perhaps in urban areas and stuff, because people like my family and my clients who want to develop our land for some other high purpose because it's in a town or a city and can't, it's rendered worthless. The bank won't even lend us money against it because the banks know, they finance these oil companies. They know how bogus these reclamation certificates are. We want to finance our land. We got to run out and get our own environmental studies done. And remember, these reclamation certificates, those are government guarantees that things have been done properly. That's your kids' money backing this up, Nate. Somebody should be more careful issuing these certificates. So if there's anything we might consider supporting, it would be to have the taxpayer might want to say, well, we'll look at the worst of these legacy wells and make sure they're safe, especially in urban areas. I got some right next to Anthony Henday Drive in Edmonton that we should be looking at. I've been ringing the alarm bell for years. I can give you a list of ministers as long as you're on in more than one government with more than one party that have absolutely ignored the problem, and they know it's out there. They know it's out there. We need to fix these things before someone dies.
Okay. And I think it's worth noting as well, like as much as the Orphan Well Society gets their money from the oil companies, the upwards of $1 billion that the federal government transferred over probably included some taxpayer money.
Oh, for sure. We were totally against the gift. And we say, we take the position that the federal money that was given, or most of it at least, I'll let Regan talk to this because he is more involved in it than I was, but it's against provincial law. Provincial law is polluter pay. So when the feds give us $1 billion, guess what? They just broke Alberta law. But that's okay. We want the feds to stay in their own lane, apparently now in Alberta, unless it benefits us somehow. Come on. So anyway, I'll let Regan talk to it because Regan was heavily involved in how the money got given to Alberta by the Fed. So I'll let him speak to it further.
So the Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project is another group similar to Polluter Pay Federation of stakeholders, and we were quite involved in the negotiations with the federal government for the aid that eventually came, $1.7 billion for inactive wells in Western Canada. And we had always advised against subsidies. We gave them advice on how they could maximize polluter pay. If they absolutely, for whatever silly political reason, needed to give subsidies, we advised them on how to do so at the least cost to clean up the most wells and create the most jobs. The only part of our advice they took was, instead of giving money to the Alberta Orphan Well Association, they took our advice on that $200 million chunk and made it a loan to the OWA. And so other than the $30 million cost of interest, they're going to, mostly oil sands producers are going to have to repay that $200 million. And so ALDP saved taxpayers $170 million on what was otherwise a no strings attached subsidy given away to producers. And unsurprisingly, as we warned against before and during, most of the money went to big oil to subsidize their drilling. And so while stuff did get cleaned up, it was far below its potential. And there hasn't been any better proposals yet, but throwing further taxpayer money at this problem, which is this federal aid was a step in the wrong direction because it insulted polluter pay, and R-Star is another insult to polluter pay. And just to make clear, if the polluter isn't going to pay in Alberta, the game is over. We don't have to bother. We're at $250 billion plus. If it's not them, It's no one else. We will just suffer the consequences. Luckily, it's already on the books. It is the law, but we're running out of time if we ever plan on enforcing it. We're within our rights. And if we did, that's my final message. The work that I started on oil and gas was about profits and royalties and how low Alberta's royalties are. We have the lowest royalty rates on earth. The NDP lowered them further in 2016. And that's where the solution is. These 300,000 holes in the ground, including the oil sands, still have lots of money coming up every year. This year in Canada, after they paid their corporate taxes and after they paid the royalties to us suckers, industry is taking home $152 billion this year. That's our money for our resources that's going into their pockets. It should be ours. And if we ran royalties like we owned it, we could collect that 150 billion. It wouldn't take anything from anyone. We wouldn't be taxing back. We don't have to prosecute anybody. But that money coming out of the ground could be directed towards cleanup, towards taking care of people that have been wronged, cleaning up old messes, and winding down the industry in line with our climate change obligations. There is more than enough money in Alberta still left to come out of the ground. We don't have to prosecute anybody or change any laws. There's enough money to pay for the cleanup and make a transition, but only if we're independent, only if we're in charge of the regulator, and only if there's democratic control to set priorities for the surplus, this treasure we're sitting on top of. There's still an enormous amount of treasure. It happens to belong to us. The law happens to be on our side. We have pressing needs. Someone needs to stand up and, like Lougheed did for that brief moment in Alberta, act like owners. From 71 to 91, we acted like owners. We made the best laws. We made solutions for everything. We collected more than, we built all the hospitals, all the high schools, and it's eroded since. We could have that back tomorrow. We could have twice that the next day, and we can keep increasing it until we have, Alberta is gifted. We have ATB, we have our own bank, we have trillions of dollars of treasure. All we need is control of it. If we were in charge of such things, we'd be made in the shade. Instead, we have Miss Smith resurrected from the grave, and we have our star we're yet to have a journalist ask a question about.
Okay.
I would just briefly add that these royalties are already so low, it's ridiculous. Let's not lower them further. There's no need. Polluter pay, return to the rule of law. If we don't, Alberta has no future at up to $1 trillion worth of cost. Industry can afford it. We can't. There's no choice. We have no choice in Alberta. We have to stick to our wise legislators. Spent 75 years putting polluter pay on the books. Let's enforce it and return to prosperity and rule of law in Alberta. That's my message.
Okay. And to be clear, one really practical, simple thing that could be done, whether we get control of the government or the regulator. The key to industry funding in Alberta is designating orphans. If there was 10,000 orphans officially on the OWA's books, Section 11 of the Oil and Gas Act requires existing industry to fully fund the full cleanup of all 10,000 of those orphans. And so if we could get orphans designated, we could get the profitable industry today funding their cleanup. The obstacle to designating orphans is only the Orphan Well Association designates them. And they leave.
No, the Alberta Energy Regulator designates them.
Yes. Only the regulator designates them, and they leave thousands of obvious, indisputable orphans undesignated. But in their wisdom, Alberta regulators have made room for more than one such private body as the OWA. There could be multiple bodies, just like the Orphan Well Association, doing the same work, designating orphans and cleaning them up and adding the cost to the levy annually charged to remaining producers. And so there could be a competitor to the OWA, something like the Polluter Pay Federation or any other group of service sector entrepreneurs in Alberta could set up an organization with all the expertise they needed to follow all the standards to officially designate, make the case, this is an orphan site, we're going to clean it up, and we're going to have the costs added to the levy. And we can challenge the regulator to deny that. We can challenge the government to implement that. But if someone could get orphans designated, we can get industry to fund them in Alberta. It's a solution we've already won, already legislated. It's sitting there with dust. If we could get law professors and other people to advocate on its behalf, all we need to do is get tens of thousands of obvious, indisputable orphans designated. Experts all over could do it. They just need the authority, the recognition, and the law allows for it. And it's equitable. This is industry's design. They designed this system. And the only thing holding back this last-ditch solution safety net we have is the captured regulator. Won't designate the orphans. That's the only thing keeping from our last-ditch safety net from kicking in, and CNRL and all the super profitable SAGD operators paying their fair share, proportional to their share of the unfunded cleanup problem, is their contribution to the levy. It's fair. There's just a crooked dam in the system. And whether through public pressure on the regulator or the government of any stripe, we could break that dam. We need to, everywhere in North America needs to designate orphans and make industry pay for them. And it's the same fight everywhere. We have a giant head start in Alberta. We have the envy of them all. We have an industry funded down to the last producer. If CNRL or Suncor is the last guy producing the last barrel, a portion of that last dollar will go to the orphan levy to pay to clean up his last mine. It's a wonderful system. We just have to use it.
Reform the Alberta Energy Regulator, in other words.
That almost sounds like, I don't know, maybe a job creation program.
Well, obviously, if we were to, there's lots of reasons why wells must be mandatorily abandoned or plugged in Alberta. One of them is if the company ceases to exist. That's the only one we're enforcing. For example, if wells aren't suspended properly on time, they must be abandoned. If the landowner's not paid, the well must be sealed. If the royalties aren't paid, the well must be sealed. On and on and on and on. If we enforce our laws, we will be abandoning many more laws. The cementing companies in Red Deer will be busy. The rigs will be busy. On and on and on and on. The service industry will do extremely well. Let's not forget that our oil industry is not just producers, especially not the 220 producers Ms. Smith is advocating for that don't even have an office. They don't employ one person. They've got 8,000 wells just sitting there. They don't even lease office space. Let's get the real facts out in front of Albertans. Let's get the service industry back to work. If we do it, we're saying the hotels will be busy across the province and the restaurants and it's not job creation. It's just a fact that if we start abandoning wells at the speed we should be, there'll be tons of business all over the province and employment all over the province. It's not job creation, it's just reality. But do it our way. Regan made a job report. How enforcing the polluter pay principle will create jobs in Alberta. It's on ALDP's website. It's there for anybody to read. It's not job creation per se. It's just obvious. It's just obvious.
And so the jobs are kind of incidental, and we can argue about how many jobs it will create, but that $250 billion of cleanup, that's $250 billion of spending. Those are dollars spent. And the only debate is how many jobs, like 10,000, 11,000. It's beside the point. It's $250 billion of spending. There's almost no capital cost involved. It uses existing equipment. So it's almost all of that translates into labor costs, to wages. And so there's an enormous potential of tens of thousands of annual jobs cleaning up wells across the province if we make the polluter pay. And it's not a job creation program. We're not doing this because it'll create more jobs than some other scheme you can dream up. It's enforcing the rule of law, protecting future taxpayers. As a result, the service sector in the oil and gas industry in Alberta can be in full employment for decades to come. There's decades of work for every oil and gas rigger in every corner of the province for decades to come. And we could make those good jobs with good hours and union protections, and they could be paid well because the polluter's paying. So we could take care of everybody and everybody could have a job. Or we can maintain no look backs, and we can try to find some way to trick taxpayers into throwing more money at this. It's a very easy choice, and I have no doubt in the common sense of Albertans I will back whatever their decision is, but I will not tolerate any of this without us being given the choice. This is an electoral issue beyond belief, and if not November 8th, this spring, somebody needs to be advocating this issue. This is our last nickel, and they're trying to give it away.
So I guess my last question for you both, you gentlemen, then, before I let you go, because I've had you for almost 2 hours now, is have you seen any interest from any of the political parties in regards to making this an electoral issue? I mean, obviously Smith is going to do whatever she's going to do in the time that she has, but has the NDP or the Alberta Party or I don't know, the Liberals or the Greens said, you know what, maybe this is important?
Well, not the party brass. No one has spoken. We know some members of the UCP and the NDP that are knowledgeable and engaged on these issues, concerned about our star, and so we know the parties are aware of the issue. They're circulating amongst the grassroots, but there's been no public word, no mention of these issues yet from politicians of any stripe. Murmurs that it could be an election issue. Even the Alberta Party considered making it part of the by-election battle, but we're still waiting to see it. I don't know. I assume everyone's terrified of being first and getting tagged with this. They'll be happy to join in the debate once someone draws the target on themselves. But November 8th is coming up pretty soon. If and she's been premier for a while now, it's hard to appreciate what the political calculus is behind keeping their powder dry this late.
Okay. Mark?
I'm not going to touch that one. Really, I'm nonpartisan, rule of law guy. I just say this, that we should change our slogan in Alberta from I love oil and gas to I love safe and legal and responsible oil and gas. And I think everybody can get behind that. Let's weed out the irresponsible from our oil patch so that we have a future in this province. If we don't, we will have no future.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen, both, so much for being as generous with your time as you have today. Really, really appreciate it. And if people want to learn more about this, because despite the fact that we're coming up to 2 hours, I feel like we've still kind of only scratched the surface. Where can they go to learn more?
Well, I'm going to hope to get Polluter Pay Federation's website back up, but we don't have any funding yet. It's been tough during COVID to try to get this thing off the ground. Let me just say that we believe we have a way to make sure that industry pays for their own counter lobby. It's the rule of law in Alberta. We just need a little push start from a few small donations from a few Albertans who don't want to pay $1 trillion for industry to push start this thing. And we give landowner talks all over the province. Warburg, Alberta has every month in the summer a landowner meeting. It's small, it's grassroots, but these landowners out there, they know what's going on. We're asked to speak there and in other places all the time. This should be going on across the province. Polluter Pay Federation's first and foremost education. We need to educate people about what's really going on in Alberta, what our laws truly are, etc. We need facts. We're not getting facts. We're not getting them from, there's no hearings. There's Alberta Energy Regulator just does what it does in the dark. And believe me, industry runs the regulator. We've got to stop that. We've got to, that's the number one thing we can do in Alberta. Okay. Reform the Alberta Energy Regulator. That's number one thing. That's what we have to do.
There's an enormous amount of resources and research at the Polluter Pay Federation website when it gets backed up. As far as the one-stop introduction, the ALDP's big cleanup report from last summer is 40 pages. illustrated sound bites citing all the recent news coverage in recent years and all the relevant facts and laws, making all of these arguments, all with footnotes. So it's a solid place. Otherwise, it's really hard to keep things straight. Everybody gets everything wrong about these issues by design. Everybody means something different. Everything they talk about, it's really hard to make sense of. But that jobs report is a bunch of Albertans talking to Albertans, and Mark has an enormous amount of resources on polluter pay, about this business model, about lobbying, about the legal precedents, the strategy behind it. We put years of effort into it at the website. If it's not up at the second, the jobs report is one thing for people to look at. And there's a lot of other stuff out there, but you'll get snippets. It'll be hard to make sense of. And that's one place you can kind of get the whole picture.
Okay. Well, if you gentlemen would be so kind, when you get that website up and running again, please let us know, and we'll make sure that we do a little update on our own as well to follow up to this thing.
It's polluterpayfederation.ca. Polluterpayfederation.ca.
Perfect. Thank you both so much.
Appreciate it. Look forward
My
to
pleasure.
seeing the reaction. Yeah.
Thanks for having us, Nate.
As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, we would love it if you swung by our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab and signed up for a small monthly sponsorship of the work that we're trying to do here. It is because of the support that we receive from our Patreon sponsors that we're able to continually up our game, and it is tremendously appreciated. So I want to throw a big thank you out to them, and you can go ahead and visit that website and join and support us as well, because we need all the help we can get. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for listening and being part of these important conversations. And we will see you next time on The Breakdown.